The candles in the great hall of Ashworth Manor burned brighter than any Alina Whitfield had ever seen. Gold light spilled across marble floors polished to a mirror shine, and the air itself seemed to hum with music, laughter, and the quiet rustle of silk gowns. She stood near the tall windows, her simple gray dress a sharp contrast to the jewels and lace surrounding her, and she felt every eye that passed over her linger just a moment too long. She had not wanted to come. It was her aunt, Margaret Whitfield, who had insisted, reminding her that an invitation to Ashworth Manor was not something a clergyman's daughter received twice in a lifetime. Alina had agreed only because her aunt's eyes had held such hope, such quiet pride, that refusing felt like a small cruelty. Now, standing beneath chandeliers dripping with crystal, she wondered if she had made a mistake. Across the room, near the grand staircase, stood the man everyone had come to see. Duke Edmund Ashworth was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the ease of a man who had never once doubted his place in the world. His dark coat was cut to perfection, his cravat tied with careless elegance, and his expression held the faint, permanent amusement of someone who found most things beneath his notice. Women watched him from behind their fans. Men sought his approval with nervous smiles. He accepted it all as his due. Alina had heard stories about him long before tonight. The village gossiped about the Duke the way people gossiped about weather or war, with a mixture of fear and fascination. He was said to be brilliant, ruthless in business, generous to those he favored, and merciless to those he did not. He had inherited his title young, after his father's sudden passing, and in the years since he had built a reputation for sharp words and sharper judgments. No one crossed him without regret. She had no intention of crossing him. She intended only to survive the evening, admire the music, and return home before her aunt grew too tired to travel. That was the whole of her plan. But plans, she would soon learn, rarely survive contact with pride. It began with a glance. Alina was standing near a table of refreshments, sipping a cup of watered wine, when she noticed a small group of young women whispering behind their fans, their eyes darting toward her with unmistakable amusement. She felt her cheeks warm but kept her chin level, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She had grown up the daughter of a country vicar with more books than coins, and she had learned long ago that dignity could not be bought, only chosen. Still, the whispers followed her like a persistent draft, cold and impossible to ignore. She moved toward the edge of the hall, hoping for a quieter corner, when she found herself unexpectedly close to the Duke's circle. Lord Percival Hargrove, a thin man with an easy laugh and cruel eyes, was speaking animatedly, and beside him stood Lady Constance Bellamy, whose beauty was matched only by her sharp tongue. The Duke stood at the center of them all, one hand resting on the back of a chair, listening with the detached patience of a king holding court. Alina tried to pass without notice. She nearly succeeded. Then the Duke's gaze found her. It was only a moment, a brief sweep of his eyes from her simple shoes to her unadorned hair, but it carried the weight of judgment as clearly as if he had spoken aloud. She saw the corner of his mouth curl, saw him lean toward Lord Hargrove and murmur something too low for her to hear. Hargrove laughed. Lady Constance's fan fluttered faster to hide her smile. Alina kept walking. She told herself it did not matter what a stranger thought of her dress or her presence. She told herself this evening would end soon enough, and she would never need to see any of these people again. But fate, it seemed, was not finished with her. Later, as the orchestra began a new piece and couples gathered for the dance, Alina found herself standing near a marble pillar, watching the swirl of color and movement with quiet fascination despite herself. The music was beautiful. The dancers moved with practiced grace. For a moment, she forgot the whispers and simply enjoyed the spectacle. That was when the Duke approached. He did not come alone. Lord Hargrove trailed behind him, along with two other gentlemen Alina did not recognize, all wearing the same expression of barely concealed amusement, as though they were approaching a jest already half told. The Duke stopped a few paces from her, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and pipe smoke that clung to his coat, and he studied her with open curiosity, the way one might study an unusual insect found indoors. "You are new to gatherings such as this," he said. It was not a question. "I am," Elinor replied evenly, "though I have attended assemblies in the county before." "County assemblies," the Duke repeated, and something in his tone made the word sound smaller than it was. "How charming." Elinor said nothing. She had learned that silence often served better than argument, especially with men who enjoyed the sound of their own wit. The Duke exchanged a glance with Lord Hargrove, and something passed between them, some private amusement Elinor was not meant to understand. Then, with the ease of a man who believed no one in the room could touch him, the Duke turned to his companions and spoke in French. His voice was smooth, almost musical, but the words themselves were far from kind. He remarked with elegant cruelty on the plainness of her gown, comparing it to the sackcloth worn by penitents. He wondered aloud, still in French, whether the invitation had been sent to her by mistake, perhaps meant for a wealthier cousin who shared her name. He suggested, with a slow smile, that she had likely never in her life tasted champagne, and that her presence among them was rather like inviting a sparrow to sing among nightingales. Lord Hargrove laughed outright. One of the other gentlemen coughed to hide his own amusement. Lady Constance, who had drifted close enough to hear, hid her smile behind her fan, though her eyes glittered with delight at the spectacle. The Duke believed, as many of his class did, that a country clergyman's daughter would have no knowledge of French beyond perhaps a handful of polite phrases learned from a governess. It was a common assumption among the wealthy that education in the languages of Europe belonged only to those with the means to travel, to hire tutors, to spend idle hours on accomplishments that served no practical purpose. He spoke as though she were no more capable of understanding him than the marble pillar beside her. He was wrong. Elinor's father, Reverend Josiah Whitfield, had been a scholar before he was a clergyman, a man who had once dreamed of teaching at Oxford before circumstances, and a smaller income than ambition led him instead to a quiet parish in the countryside. He had filled their modest home with books instead of furniture, and he had taught his only daughter to read Latin before she could properly write her own name in English. French had come later, taught patiently over long winter evenings by candlelight, using letters from a cousin who had married a Frenchman and settled near Lyon. Italian had followed soon after, learned from a collection of poetry the Reverend had treasured since his own university days. Elinor had grown up believing that knowledge was the one inheritance no one could take from her, and she had absorbed it as eagerly as a plant turns toward the sun. She understood every word the Duke had spoken. For a moment the hall seemed to hold its breath around her. The music continued, distant and unconcerned, while laughter rippled through the small circle gathered near the pillar. Elinor felt the heat rise in her face, not from embarrassment, but from something sharper, something that steadied her spine and cleared her mind with sudden, cold clarity. She could pretend she had not understood. She could smile politely, curtsy, and walk away, allowing the moment to pass as countless insults before it had passed, unanswered and unacknowledged. It would have been the easier path. But Elinor had never been especially fond of easy paths. She lifted her chin, met the Duke's eyes directly, and allowed herself the smallest of smiles. "Your Grace," she said, her voice calm and clear enough to carry to those nearby, "I must correct a small misunderstanding. This gown, though simple, was chosen with care, not carelessness. And as for the sparrow you mentioned, I would remind you that sparrows are known for their persistence, not their silence." The Duke's eyebrows rose slightly, though his smile did not falter. He had clearly expected either confusion or offense, not a composed reply delivered in perfect, unhurried English. He tilted his head, studying her with fresh interest, as though reconsidering an opponent he had underestimated. "You understood me," he said, sounding almost impressed despite himself. "I did," Elinor answered. Then, switching smoothly into French, her accent precise and unhesitating, she continued. She told him that she found it curious that a man of such supposed refinement would choose cruelty as his form of wit, and that true elegance, in her experience, required no audience of laughing friends to prove itself. She spoke of how her father had often said that a man who mocked what he did not understand revealed more about his own limitations than about the object of his scorn. The laughter around them died as quickly as it had begun. Lord Hargrove's smile faded into confusion. The other gentlemen exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unsure whether they were witnessing an insult, a rebuke, or something else entirely. Lady Constance's fan stilled completely, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and unwilling admiration. The Duke, for the first time that evening, said nothing at all. Elinor did not wait for a response. She offered a small, perfectly correct curtsy, the kind taught to every young lady regardless of her fortune, and turned to walk away, her steps unhurried, her back straight. She did not look to see the expression on the Duke's face. She did not need to. She could feel the silence trailing behind her like a physical thing, heavy and astonished, filling the space where laughter had been only moments before. Behind her she heard Lord Hargrove attempt a joke to break the tension, his voice too loud, too eager. No one laughed with him. Elinor made her way toward the edge of the hall, her heart pounding harder than she cared to admit, though her face remained composed. She found her aunt near the refreshment table, speaking with an elderly woman about the weather, entirely unaware of what had just transpired near the pillar. Elinor accepted a fresh cup of watered wine with a steady hand and forced herself to breathe evenly, though inside she felt something close to triumph, sharp and unfamiliar. She had not sought this confrontation. She had wanted nothing more than to pass the evening quietly and return home, but she would not apologize even to herself for refusing to be diminished. Her father had taught her that knowledge was armor, and tonight, for the first time, she had felt the truth of those words settle into her bones. Across the hall, the Duke remained standing near the pillar, his companions murmuring around him, though he seemed not to hear them. His eyes followed Elinor's retreating figure with an expression none of his friends had ever seen on his face before, something between disbelief and reluctant fascination. He had spent his entire life certain of his own superiority, certain that wit and wealth walked hand in hand, that intelligence belonged to those born into privilege. A country vicar's daughter, in a plain gray gown, had just proven him wrong in front of half of society. The orchestra began a new piece, and the dancers resumed their movements, but something in the air of Ashworth Manor had shifted, quiet and unseen, like the first crack forming in a stone believed to be unbreakable. Few in the hall understood exactly what had happened near the pillar. Fewer still understood what it meant, but among those who had witnessed it, a single truth had settled, impossible now to unsee. The Duke of Ashworth had met his match, and she had not even raised her voice to prove it. As the evening wore on, Elinor tried to lose herself once more in the music and color of the ball, but she could feel eyes upon her now for an entirely different reason. Where before she had been an object of quiet mockery, she was now a subject of whispered speculation. Who was she? Where had she learned such flawless French? Was it true she had spoken to the Duke himself and left him without a reply? She did not seek out these conversations, but fragments of them reached her all the same, carried on the drifting currents of ballroom gossip. She kept her expression neutral, her manner composed, though inwardly she marveled at how quickly a single moment could alter the shape of an entire evening. She had come to Ashworth Manor expecting to be invisible, tolerated at best, mocked at worst. She had not expected to become, however briefly, the most discussed guest in the room. Nor had she expected the small, persistent flutter of unease that settled beneath her satisfaction. A quiet voice warning her that a man like the Duke of Ashworth did not easily forget being bested, especially not in front of his closest companions. Pride, she knew, could be a dangerous thing to wound, and she had wounded his without hesitation. She did not yet know how right that instinct would prove to be, nor how far the consequences of one sharp reply, spoken in perfect French before a room full of witnesses, would carry her in the days and weeks that followed. She only knew, as she finally stepped into her aunt's carriage under a sky scattered with distant stars, that whatever came next, she would not regret the words she had spoken. The candles of Ashworth Manor had burned lower, the music had softened, and somewhere behind her, in a grand hall full of glittering strangers, a duke stood in stunned silence, his certainty shaken for the very first time in his life. The carriage rattled gently over the country road, and Alina rested her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the dark fields roll past under a sky full of stars. Her aunt dozed beside her, worn out from the excitement of the evening, but Alina's mind refused to settle. She replayed the moment near the pillar again and again, each time feeling the same strange mixture of pride and apprehension. She had not planned to speak. She had not planned to be noticed at all. Yet something in the Duke's careless cruelty had struck a nerve she had not known was so easily provoked, and once provoked, she had found she could not stay silent. She thought of her father, asleep by now in his small study surrounded by towers of borrowed books, and she smiled faintly, wondering what he would say if he knew his daughter had used his careful lessons to silence a duke in the middle of a crowded ballroom. He had always told her that education was not meant to be hidden away like a secret shame, but she had never truly believed she would need to defend that belief in front of society's most powerful circle. As the carriage wheels turned steadily toward home, Alina allowed herself, just once, to wonder whether tonight's events were truly finished, or whether she had only opened a door that could not easily be closed again. Somewhere behind her, in the glittering world she had just left, a proud man's composure had cracked for the first time in years, and pride, once wounded, rarely stayed quiet for long. Word of the encounter at Ashworth Manor did not stay contained within the walls of the great hall. By the following afternoon, it had already begun its quiet journey through the drawing rooms and tea tables of the county, carried by servants who had overheard, by guests eager to share what they had witnessed, and by those who had not been present at all but repeated the story with growing embellishment. Alina Whitfield, the vicar's daughter, had answered the Duke of Ashworth in flawless French and left him speechless before half the county's finest families. The tale traveled faster than any carriage could carry it. Alina herself remained largely unaware of how quickly the story was spreading. She spent the days following the ball much as she spent any other, helping her father prepare his sermons, tending the small garden behind the vicarage, and reading in the quiet hours after supper. She told herself the matter was finished, a single evening's incident that would soon fade from memory as more interesting gossip took its place. She was, in this assumption, entirely mistaken. The Duke of Ashworth was not a man accustomed to being outmatched, and he was even less accustomed to being outmatched publicly. In the days following the ball, he found himself unable to shake the memory of the moment near the pillar, the calm certainty in Alina's voice, the precision of her French, and above all, the small, knowing smile she had offered before walking away. He told himself it did not matter. He told himself she was simply a country girl who had memorized a few clever phrases to impress her betters. Yet the more he repeated these reassurances to himself, the less convincing they became. Lord Percival Hargrove, ever eager to please his powerful friend, attempted several times to steer conversation away from the incident, but found the Duke returning to it unprompted, asking pointed questions about the Whitfield family, about the Reverend's background, about where exactly a clergyman's daughter might have learned to speak French with such precision. Hargrove, sensing an opportunity to regain favor after his own embarrassment at the ball, began making inquiries of his own, determined to uncover something, anything, that might restore the natural order of things. What he discovered only deepened the mystery. Reverend Josiah Whitfield, it turned out, had once been considered among the finest scholars of his generation before financial misfortune, and a difficult family situation had led him away from academic life and into the quiet obscurity of a country parish. He had studied at Oxford, corresponded with scholars across Europe in his youth, and was rumored to possess one of the finest private libraries in the county, modest in size but exceptional in quality. His daughter, it seemed, had grown up steeped in languages and literature, the way other young women grew up steeped in embroidery and music. This information did nothing to soothe the Duke's wounded pride. If anything, it sharpened his determination to see the matter settled properly, though he could not entirely explain to himself what settling the matter would even mean. Revenge felt beneath him, yet the alternative, simply allowing the incident to pass unanswered, felt equally intolerable. He found himself, much to his own irritation, thinking of Alina Whitfield far more often than a man in his position had any reason to think of a clergyman's daughter. The opportunity for a second meeting arrived sooner than either of them expected. Lady Constance Bellamy, who had witnessed the exchange at the ball and had been quietly fascinated by it ever since, decided to host a small gathering at her family's estate, ostensibly to celebrate her mother's birthday, though those who knew her well understood that Lady Constance rarely did anything without a secondary motive. She had been genuinely impressed by Alina's composure that evening, impressed enough to overcome her initial amusement at the girl's expense, and she found herself curious to see what might happen if the Duke and the vicar's daughter were placed once more within the same room. The invitation arrived at the vicarage on a bright morning, carried by a liveried servant who seemed faintly surprised to be delivering correspondence to such a modest home. Alina's aunt was beside herself with excitement, certain that this second invitation confirmed some new and wonderful shift in their family's social standing. Alina herself felt a flicker of unease she could not quite name, though she agreed to attend, telling herself there was no reasonable cause for concern. The gathering at the Bellamy estate was smaller and more intimate than the grand ball at Ashworth Manor, held in a sunlit drawing room rather than a sprawling hall, with perhaps 30 guests rather than hundreds. Alina arrived with her aunt in the early afternoon, dressed once more in modest but carefully chosen attire, her dark hair pinned neatly, her manner composed despite the persistent flutter of nerves beneath her calm exterior. She saw the Duke almost immediately upon entering the room. He stood near a tall window, engaged in conversation with an older gentleman, though his attention seemed only partially fixed on whatever the man was saying. When Alina entered, his eyes found her instantly, and something in his expression shifted, a mixture of recognition and something harder to define, curiosity perhaps, or wariness, or both at once. For a while they did not speak. Alina busied herself with polite conversation among the other guests, admiring the gardens visible through the windows, discussing the fine weather and Lady Constance's excellent taste in refreshments. She was aware, throughout, of the Duke's occasional glances in her direction, though he made no immediate move to approach her, and she began to hope, foolishly perhaps, that the afternoon might pass without further incident. That hope did not survive the hour. As the guests gathered for tea in the drawing room, Lady Constance, ever the skillful hostess with an eye for drama, arranged the seating in such a way that Alina found herself placed directly across from the Duke, with only a low table of delicate china between them. Whether this was deliberate mischief or simple coincidence, Alina could not say, though the knowing gleam in Lady Constance's eyes suggested the former. The Duke regarded Alina across the table, with the same careful curiosity he had shown upon her arrival. For a time conversation flowed generally among the group, touching on matters of little consequence, the state of the roads, the quality of the season's harvest, a recent addition to the county's small circulating library. Alina participated where appropriate, kept her opinions measured, and hoped the afternoon might continue in this pleasant, uneventful manner. Then the Duke spoke directly to her for the first time since the ball. "Miss Whitfield," he said, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear, though pitched with a formality that suggested careful control rather than genuine warmth. "I find myself curious. Your command of French at Ashworth Manor was, I confess, unexpected. I wonder whether your education extends to other tongues, or whether French alone happened to be your particular accomplishment." The question hung in the air, and Alina understood immediately that it was not idle curiosity. The Duke was testing her, perhaps hoping to expose some limitation, some gap in her education that would allow him to reclaim the ground he had lost at the ball. Several of the other guests turned their attention toward the exchange, sensing, as gatherings of this kind often did, that something more interesting than tea and pleasantries was about to unfold. Alina considered her response carefully before speaking. She had learned, in the days since the ball, that hesitation could be mistaken for weakness, and she had no intention of appearing uncertain now. "My education has never confined itself to a single language, Your Grace," she replied evenly. My father believed that understanding a people required understanding their words, and so he taught me to read and speak in several tongues, as his own education allowed. Several, the Duke repeated, one eyebrow lifting slightly. How ambitious for a country parish. Ambition, I have found, is not limited by geography, Elinor said. Only by opportunity, and my father made certain I had opportunity in abundance, even where wealth was lacking. A ripple of quiet amusement passed through the nearby guests, though it was directed, this time, at the Duke rather than at Elinor. His expression tightened almost imperceptibly, though he recovered quickly, offering a thin smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Perhaps you might demonstrate, he said, since French alone has already been proven. Italian, for instance. I understand it is a language much favored by poets and romantics, though I confess I have always found it rather too soft for serious conversation. It was, Elinor recognized immediately, both a challenge and an insult wrapped together, delivered with the same practiced elegance he had used at the ball. He was testing not only her knowledge but her composure, hoping perhaps that the pressure of a direct challenge before an audience would succeed where mockery alone had failed. Elinor met his eyes steadily, and something in her calm, unhurried manner suggested she had expected this moment, had perhaps even welcomed it. Soft, your grace, she said, is not the same as weak. I would suggest that a language capable of producing Dante's vision of paradise and inferno alike possesses rather more strength than gentleness alone might suggest. Then, without further hesitation, she continued in Italian, her accent smooth and unhurried, her words chosen with evident care. She spoke of how poetry, far from being a soft or lesser pursuit, often carried truths too large or too painful for ordinary conversation, and that a man who dismissed such language as merely romantic perhaps had never encountered verses sharp enough to wound as effectively as any blade. She spoke, too, of pride, though carefully, weaving her meaning into the structure of a well-known verse rather than stating it outright, allowing those who understood the allusion to draw their own conclusions about the man seated across from her. The room fell quiet in a way it had not fallen quiet before. Several of the guests exchanged startled glances, clearly understanding at least fragments of what Elinor had said, while others watched the Duke's face for some sign of how to react. The Duke's expression, for the second time in as many meetings, betrayed genuine surprise. He had expected, perhaps, a few memorized phrases, enough to embarrass him mildly before the conversation moved elsewhere. He had not expected fluency, nor had he expected the pointed elegance of her chosen words, delivered with such evident understanding of the language's deeper currents. You quote Dante, he said slowly, to criticize me. I quote Dante, Elinor corrected gently, to illustrate a point about language, your grace. Any resemblance you find to your own circumstances is, of course, entirely your own interpretation. A soft laugh escaped one of the older guests before he could stop himself, quickly disguised as a cough. Lady Constance's fan fluttered rapidly, though her eyes danced with unmistakable delight at how the afternoon was unfolding. The Duke, to his credit, did not allow his composure to crack entirely, though a flush of color rose along his jaw, and his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the delicate teacup in his hand. He set the cup down with careful precision, buying himself a moment to recover his thoughts. It was at this point that Lord Hargrove, seated a short distance away and clearly uncomfortable with how the exchange had turned once more against his friend, decided to intervene, though his intervention would prove even less successful than the Duke's own attempts. Surely, Hargrove said, his voice carrying a note of forced amusement, anyone might memorize a pretty verse or two to impress a room. It hardly proves true understanding, only a fondness for performance. Elinor turned her attention toward him, and though her expression remained perfectly polite, something in her eyes suggested she recognized the challenge for exactly what it was, an attempt to salvage the Duke's dignity by casting doubt on her own sincerity. You suggest, Lord Hargrove, that memorization and understanding are the same thing, she said. I would gently disagree. A parrot may memorize words without grasping their meaning. Understanding requires something more, the ability to apply knowledge beyond its original context, to reason with it, to build upon it. Memorization is merely the foundation. Understanding is the structure built upon that foundation. A fine distinction, Hargrove said, though his tone suggested he did not entirely believe it, but a distinction easily claimed and difficult to prove. Elinor considered him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, a quiet, deliberate resolve settling over her features. She understood in that moment that this conversation would not end with French and Italian alone. Hargrove had, without perhaps intending to, opened a door that she now felt compelled to walk through, not out of pride, but out of a quiet, steady conviction that she would not allow her knowledge to be dismissed as mere performance. "Then allow me to prove it beyond memorization," she said calmly, and the room seemed to lean forward collectively in anticipation of what would come next. The Duke watched her with an expression that had, somewhere in the course of the conversation, shifted from wounded pride into something closer to genuine, reluctant fascination, though he would not have admitted as much aloud, not even to himself. The drawing-room had grown warmer, though whether from the afternoon sun pouring through the tall windows or from the tension gathering around the low table of china, Elinor could not have said. She was aware of every eye upon her now, aware of her aunt sitting rigid with a mixture of pride and worry near the far wall, aware of Lady Constance leaning forward with undisguised eagerness, her earlier amusement transformed into something closer to fascination. Lord Hargrove's challenge hung in the air, and Elinor understood that the moment called for something more than clever phrases borrowed from familiar poetry. It called for precision, for a demonstration that would leave no room for doubt or dismissal. She thought of her father's study, of the long winter evenings spent working through Latin texts by candlelight, of the patient way he had drilled declensions and conjugations into her memory until they became as natural as breathing. "Lord Hargrove," she said, her voice steady, "you suggest that understanding is difficult to prove. I would offer a different language entirely, one that neither French nor Italian can claim, one that predates the poetry we have already discussed by many centuries. Latin, I believe, is generally considered the foundation upon which much of our modern learning rests. Perhaps that would serve as sufficient proof." A murmur passed through the assembled guests. Latin was, among the ladies present, a language rarely studied beyond a handful of phrases learned for decorative purposes, and even among the gentlemen, true fluency was far less common than polite society liked to pretend. It was the language of scholars, of clergymen, of ancient texts studied at university by young men destined for the law or the church, not typically a language associated with young women, however well educated. The Duke's eyes narrowed slightly, though whether from renewed skepticism or genuine curiosity, Elinor could not immediately tell. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with the careful attention of a man reassessing an opponent he had badly underestimated not once, but twice. "Latin," he said slowly, testing the word as though weighing its implications. "A bold claim, Miss Whitfield. Perhaps you might explain, in that ancient tongue, why a woman of your circumstances would devote herself to studies so far removed from anything practical." It was, Elinor recognized immediately, a deliberately difficult challenge, requiring not simply memorized phrases but genuine composition, the ability to construct original thought in a language known for its precision and complexity. She felt a flicker of nervousness beneath her calm exterior, though she refused to let it show. She drew a slow breath, gathering her thoughts, and then began to speak. Her Latin was careful, measured, each word chosen with evident deliberation rather than rushed or uncertain. She spoke of how true nobility, in the eyes of the ancient philosophers, was never a matter of birth or title, but of virtue and wisdom cultivated through discipline and study. She referenced, with quiet precision, the teachings of Seneca, who had written extensively on the nature of true worth, arguing that circumstance and fortune were external things, subject to change, while character and knowledge remained the only possessions truly belonging to a person. She suggested, still in flawless Latin, that a title inherited at birth proved nothing about the character of the man who bore it, only about the fortune of his ancestors, and that the truest measure of nobility lay not in the accident of one's birth, but in the deliberate cultivation of wisdom, patience, and restraint. She did not look directly at the Duke as she spoke these final words, though the implication was unmistakable to everyone listening, and several guests exchanged startled glances, understanding perfectly well what she had just suggested about the man seated across from her, delivered with such elegance and precision that he could not possibly claim offense without confirming the very point she had made. The room fell utterly silent. The Duke sat perfectly still, his teacup forgotten on the table before him, his expression unreadable in a way that Alina found almost more unsettling than open anger would have been. She had expected, perhaps, a sharp retort, some clever attempt to reclaim the upper hand as he had tried after her French reply and again after her Italian one. Instead, he simply sat in silence, studying her with an intensity that made her wonder briefly whether she had finally gone too far. Lord Hargrove, for his part, had gone quite pale, his earlier confidence entirely evaporated. He opened his mouth as though to say something, then closed it again, apparently unable to find any words adequate to the moment. The other guests seemed similarly frozen, caught between admiration for Alina's evident brilliance and uncertainty about how the Duke would respond to such a pointed, if elegantly delivered, rebuke. It was Lady Constance who finally broke the silence, though her voice carried a note of genuine wonder rather than her usual playful mischief. "Miss Whitfield," she said softly, "I do not believe I have ever witnessed anything quite like this." Alina allowed herself a small, careful smile, though her heart was pounding rapidly beneath her composed exterior. She had spoken her mind, perhaps more boldly than wisdom might have counseled, and she was not entirely certain what consequences might follow from having so thoroughly humbled a man of the Duke's power and pride in front of witnesses who would certainly carry the story far beyond the walls of this drawing-room. The Duke rose slowly from his chair, and for a moment Alina braced herself for anger, for some cutting remark designed to restore his wounded dignity at her expense. Instead, to the astonishment of everyone present, he did something entirely unexpected. He bowed. It was a small gesture, formal and precise, the kind of bow one offered to an equal rather than a dismissal offered to an inferior, and it carried none of the mockery that had characterized his earlier interactions with her. When he straightened, his expression had shifted once more, the earlier tension replaced by something that looked, remarkably, like genuine respect, however reluctantly given. "Miss Whitfield," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier condescension, "I believe I owe you an apology, though I confess I am unaccustomed to offering them. You have proven your point rather thoroughly, in 3 languages, no less, and I find myself with very little ground remaining upon which to stand." The room seemed to exhale collectively, the tension breaking into a ripple of surprised murmurs and quiet laughter, though this laughter carried none of the mockery of the earlier evening at Ashworth Manor. It was, instead, the laughter of an audience who had witnessed something remarkable, something worth remembering and retelling for weeks to come. Alina rose from her seat and offered a small curtsy, her composure returning gradually as the immediate tension of the confrontation began to fade. "Your Grace is gracious to acknowledge it," she said carefully. "I meant no true disrespect, only to demonstrate that understanding cannot be dismissed simply because it arrives from unexpected origins." "A lesson I suspect I shall not soon forget," the Duke replied, and though his tone remained formal, there was something new beneath it, a genuine curiosity that had not been present before, as though he were seeing her for the first time not as an amusing curiosity or a wounded pride to be salved, but as a person of genuine substance, worthy of consideration in her own right. The remainder of the gathering passed with considerably less drama, though the atmosphere in the room had shifted permanently. Guests who had previously regarded Alina with polite indifference now approached her with evident curiosity, asking about her education, her father's library, her thoughts on various matters of literature and philosophy. She found herself, for the first time in her life, treated not as a curiosity to be tolerated but as an intellect to be engaged with. And though the attention felt strange and somewhat overwhelming, she could not deny a quiet satisfaction at how thoroughly the afternoon had unfolded. The Duke said little more to her directly for the remainder of the gathering, though Elinor noticed, on several occasions, his gaze drifting toward her across the room, thoughtful and considering, entirely different from the dismissive glance he had offered at the ball only days before. When at last the gathering began to disperse and guests made their farewells, he approached her once more, this time without the audience that had witnessed their earlier exchange. "Miss Whitfield," he said quietly, "I find myself curious about your father's library. It is not often one encounters such thorough education outside the walls of university, and I confess a genuine interest in understanding how it came to be." Elinor studied him carefully, searching his expression for any trace of the earlier mockery, but found none. "My father would likely be honored by your Grace's interest," she said carefully, "though I confess I am somewhat surprised by it." "As am I," the Duke admitted, with the faintest trace of a genuine, rather than performed, smile. "I have rarely been surprised by anyone in recent years, Miss Whitfield. You have managed it twice in 1 week." With that, he offered another small bow and took his leave, joining Lord Hargrove and the others as they departed the Bellamy estate, leaving Elinor standing near the window with her aunt, who had watched the entire exchange with an expression of dazed astonishment. "Elinor," her aunt whispered once the Duke had gone, "I do believe you have made quite an impression." Elinor watched the carriages departing down the long drive, her thoughts a tangle of satisfaction, disbelief, and a quiet, persistent uncertainty about what might come next. She had entered the afternoon expecting little more than tea and polite conversation. She had left having thoroughly humbled one of the most powerful men in the county, not once but across 3 languages, in front of witnesses who would undoubtedly ensure the story spread even further than the tale of the ball itself. She did not yet know whether this was a victory to be celebrated or a complication that would follow her far longer than she anticipated. She only knew, as she settled into the carriage beside her aunt for the journey home, that her quiet, ordinary life had shifted onto a path she could no longer fully predict, and that the Duke of Ashworth, humbled though he had been, was not a man likely to simply disappear from her life after such an encounter. Within a fortnight, the story of the drawing room at the Bellamy estate had traveled well beyond the boundaries of the county, carried by letters between friends, by conversations exchanged over dinner tables, and by the endless appetite of society for anything resembling scandal or spectacle. The tale grew with each retelling, as such tales always do, until Elinor found herself hearing versions of the story so exaggerated she barely recognized them as her own experience. In some accounts, she had scolded the Duke in 5 languages rather than 3. In others, she had reduced him to genuine tears before the assembled guests, a detail so far from the truth that Elinor could only laugh when she heard it repeated by a well-meaning neighbor who had no idea she was speaking to the very woman at the center of the tale. Not everyone found the story amusing. Among the county's established families, opinion regarding Elinor Whitfield had divided sharply. Some regarded her with newfound admiration, impressed by her evident intelligence and the composure she had shown in the face of the Duke's initial cruelty. Invitations began arriving at the vicarage with unusual frequency, from families who had previously shown little interest in the Reverend's modest household, eager now to include the clever young woman who had bested the county's most formidable nobleman in a battle of wits. Others viewed the matter with considerably less warmth. Lady Constance's mother, though pleased with the drama her daughter's gathering had produced, expressed private concern that Elinor's boldness reflected poorly on proper feminine decorum, a sentiment shared by several older matrons who believed a young woman's education, however impressive, ought never to be displayed so publicly, particularly not at the expense of a duke's dignity. Whispers of impropriety began circulating alongside the admiration, and Elinor found herself the subject of conversations she was rarely permitted to participate in directly, hearing only fragments second-hand, filtered through the opinions of those who repeated them. Lord Hargrove, humiliated by his own poor showing during the exchange, proved considerably less gracious than the Duke had ultimately been. Where the Duke had offered a genuine, if reluctant, acknowledgment of Aliner's abilities, Hargrove nursed his wounded pride with growing resentment, and he began, subtly at first, to suggest to anyone who would listen that Aliner's display had been rehearsed, perhaps even coached by her father in advance, designed deliberately to embarrass the Duke and elevate her family's standing through calculated spectacle rather than genuine spontaneous ability. These suggestions found fertile ground among those already inclined to resent the sudden attention Aliner had received, and within days, a second version of the story began circulating alongside the first, one considerably less flattering, painting Aliner not as a woman of genuine accomplishment, but as a scheming opportunist who had manipulated a social gathering for personal advancement. Aliner heard fragments of this alternate narrative during a visit to the local market, overhearing two women discussing the matter with evident disapproval, and she felt, for the first time since the confrontation, a genuine pang of anxiety about what she had unleashed. Her father, when she confided her concerns to him one evening in his cluttered study, listened patiently before offering his characteristic calm wisdom. "Aliner," he said, setting aside the sermon he had been drafting, "you cannot control how others choose to interpret your actions. You spoke honestly, and you spoke from genuine knowledge, not performance. Those who wish to diminish that truth will always find reasons to do so, regardless of how carefully you conduct yourself. The measure of your character lies not in avoiding all criticism, which is impossible, but in remaining true to your convictions despite it." Aliner found some comfort in her father's words, though the unease did not entirely fade. She had never sought attention, had never wanted to become the subject of county gossip, favorable or otherwise, and the sudden weight of so much scrutiny sat uncomfortably upon her, a burden she had not anticipated when she first stepped into her modest gray gown for the ball at Ashworth Manor. Meanwhile, at Ashworth Manor itself, the Duke found himself dealing with a rather different set of consequences. His own reputation, built carefully over years of calculated wit and confident superiority, had suffered a blow considerably more significant than he had initially anticipated. Where he had once been regarded with a mixture of admiration and mild fear, the county's aristocracy now viewed him with something new, an amused curiosity about whether the great Duke of Ashworth might finally have met someone capable of matching, and even surpassing, his own considerable intellect. Some found this development delightful, eager to witness what might happen should the two encounter one another again. Others, particularly among his closest circle, found it deeply unsettling, a crack in the carefully maintained image of infallibility that had defined the Duke's public persona for years. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret Ashworth, a formidable woman in her own right, summoned him to her private sitting room within days of hearing the story, her expression carrying the particular sternness she reserved for matters of genuine importance rather than mere social trivialities. "Edmund," she said, using his given name in the manner she reserved for moments requiring his full attention, "I understand you have been thoroughly humbled by a country clergyman's daughter, and in front of half the county's finest families, no less." The Duke, seated across from his mother with considerably less confidence than he typically displayed in public, found himself uncertain how to respond. "Mother, the situation was considerably more complicated than the rumors likely suggest." "I am certain it was," the Dowager Duchess replied, though her tone suggested she found the entire matter rather more amusing than she was willing to openly admit. "Tell me about her." The Duke hesitated, surprised by the direct nature of the question. He had expected admonishment, perhaps a lecture on maintaining proper dignity befitting his title, not genuine curiosity about the woman responsible for his public embarrassment. "She is," he began, then paused, searching for words adequate to describe what he had witnessed across 3 separate encounters. "She is unlike anyone I have met, Mother. Her mind is sharper than any I have encountered among the ladies of our own circle, and considerably sharper than most of the gentlemen as well, myself included. I am beginning to suspect. The Dowager Duchess studied her son with careful attention, noting something in his expression she had not seen in years, a genuine engagement that went beyond simple wounded pride. "You sound almost admiring, Edmund." "I sound," the Duke said slowly, as though working through the realization even as he spoke it aloud, "considerably more confused than I would like to admit." His mother's expression softened slightly, though she said nothing further on the matter, choosing instead to redirect their conversation toward other family business. But the seed of curiosity had been planted, and in the days that followed, the Duke found his thoughts returning again and again to Alina Whitfield, to the calm certainty of her voice as she had spoken Latin across the low table at the Bellamy estate, to the way she had refused to be diminished despite his own initial cruelty, to the quiet dignity with which she had accepted his eventual apology. He told himself, repeatedly, that his interest was purely intellectual, a natural curiosity about an unusually accomplished young woman who had happened to cross his path under unusual circumstances. He told himself this so often, in fact, that he began to suspect the very repetition of the thought suggested something rather less simple than mere intellectual curiosity. It was Lord Hargrove, ironically, who first suggested a path forward, though his motives were considerably less noble than the Duke's own growing fascination. "You ought to invite her family to Ashworth Manor," Hargrove suggested one afternoon, as the two men rode together across the Duke's extensive grounds. "A proper dinner, perhaps. It would allow you the opportunity to demonstrate that you bear no ill will toward the girl, and it would put an end to the more unflattering rumors currently circulating about the whole affair." The Duke considered this suggestion carefully, recognizing, correctly, that Hargrove's true motive likely involved salvaging his own damaged reputation rather than any genuine concern for Alina's welfare. Yet despite this recognition, the Duke found the idea itself rather appealing, and within days an invitation was drafted and sent to the vicarage, inviting Reverend Whitfield and his family to dine at Ashworth Manor the following week. The invitation arrived at the vicarage on a quiet Tuesday morning, and Alina's aunt nearly dropped her teacup upon reading it aloud. "Ashworth Manor," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "Alina, the Duke himself has invited us to dine." Alina took the letter from her aunt's trembling hands and read it carefully, her own reaction considerably more measured than her aunt's evident excitement. She recognized, immediately, the significance of such an invitation, extended not to a public gathering where witnesses might soften any potential awkwardness, but to an intimate dinner within the Duke's own home, where whatever conversation followed would occur without the protective distance of a crowded ballroom or drawing room full of curious onlookers. She felt, reading the elegant script of the invitation, a strange mixture of apprehension and something else entirely, something she could not immediately name, though it fluttered uncomfortably beneath her ribs as she considered what such an evening might hold. Her father, when consulted, expressed cautious approval, though he studied his daughter carefully as he offered it. "You need not attend if you feel any hesitation, Alina. The Duke's apology, while gracious, does not obligate you to accept further engagement with him." "I know, father," Alina replied, though even as she spoke the words, she found herself already composing in her mind the careful, thoughtful conversation she might have with the Duke should the evening's circumstances allow for genuine discussion rather than performance. She told herself her curiosity was purely a matter of intellectual interest, much as the Duke had told himself the same regarding her, though neither of them, in the privacy of their own thoughts, entirely believed the explanation. The days leading up to the dinner passed slowly for Alina, filled with a nervous energy she found difficult to explain even to herself. She helped her aunt select an appropriate gown, this time slightly finer than the simple attire she had worn to the ball, though still modest compared to the elaborate fashions favored by the county's wealthier families. She found herself, in quiet moments, rehearsing potential conversations, considering what topics might arise, what questions the Duke might ask, what she herself might wish to ask him in return. She told herself repeatedly that the dinner was simply an opportunity to put the entire affair to rest, to demonstrate that no lasting animosity existed between herself and the Duke, and to allow the county's gossip to finally quiet down. Yet beneath these practical justifications lay a quieter, less easily dismissed curiosity about the man himself, about who he might be beneath the careless cruelty she had witnessed at the ball, about whether the genuine respect he had shown at the Bellamy estate reflected a deeper capacity for change than his earlier behavior had suggested. As the carriage carrying Alina and her family made its way once more toward Ashworth Manor, this time under the golden light of early evening rather than the glittering darkness of a grand ball, Alina found herself watching the familiar grounds approach with a complicated mixture of anticipation and uncertainty, aware that whatever occurred within those walls tonight would likely determine the shape of whatever came next, for better or for worse. Ashworth Manor looked entirely different by the soft glow of early evening than it had beneath the blazing chandeliers of the grand ball. The stone facade caught the last warm light of the setting sun, and the grounds, quiet now without the crowds of carriages and guests, seemed almost peaceful, the gardens stretching away toward distant hills in neat, orderly rows of hedges and late summer blooms. Alina stepped down from the carriage with her father and aunt, smoothing the front of her gown, and felt her heart beating with an intensity that had little to do with nervousness alone. A servant led them through the entrance hall, past portraits of Ashworth ancestors staring down with the same aristocratic confidence Alina had come to associate with the family, and into a smaller, more intimate dining room than the grand hall she remembered from the ball. A long table had been set with fine china and gleaming silver, though the arrangement suggested a gathering of perhaps a dozen guests rather than the hundreds who had attended the earlier event. The Duke stood near the window when they entered, dressed with his usual careful elegance, though something in his posture seemed less rigid than Alina remembered, less performed. When his eyes found hers across the room, he offered a small, genuine smile, entirely different from the amused smirk that had characterized their first encounter. "Reverend Whitfield," he said, crossing the room to greet Alina's father with a warmth that surprised everyone present, "I am grateful you accepted my invitation. And Miss Whitfield," he continued, turning to Alina, "I confess I have been looking forward to this evening rather more than I care to admit." Alina offered a careful curtsy, studying his expression for any trace of the earlier condescension, but found instead something that looked remarkably like genuine anticipation. "Your Grace is kind to have extended the invitation," she said. "I hope this evening might put to rest some of the more unflattering rumors currently circulating about our previous encounters." "I hope for considerably more than that," the Duke replied, and something in his tone made Alina's aunt exchange a meaningful glance with Reverend Whitfield, though Alina herself chose not to examine too closely what exactly the Duke might mean by such a statement. The dinner that followed unfolded far differently than Alina had anticipated. Rather than the performative wit and careful social maneuvering she had expected, the conversation flowed with surprising ease, touching on matters of genuine substance rather than empty pleasantries. The Duke, it turned out, possessed a mind considerably sharper than his earlier cruelty had suggested, and once freed from the need to perform superiority before an audience of admiring friends, he proved himself capable of genuine, thoughtful discussion. He asked Alina about her father's library, about the specific texts that had shaped her education, listening with evident interest as she described the long winter evenings spent working through Latin declensions by candlelight, the collection of Italian poetry that had first introduced her to Dante's careful balance of beauty and severity, the letters from her French cousin that had gradually built her fluency through years of patient correspondence. "You speak of these studies as though they were a great adventure," the Duke observed at one point, watching her with genuine curiosity as she described a particularly difficult passage of philosophy she had once spent weeks untangling with her father's guidance. "Most young women I have known regard education as a necessary burden, a set of accomplishments to be acquired and displayed rather than genuinely pursued." "Perhaps," Alina said thoughtfully, That is because most young women are taught to view education as decoration rather than substance. My father never allowed me such a limited view. He believed knowledge belonged to anyone willing to pursue it with sufficient dedication, regardless of birth or fortune, and he raised me accordingly. The Duke considered this for a long moment, his expression thoughtful in a way that suggested genuine reflection rather than mere polite interest. I confess, Miss Whitfield, that my own education, extensive as it was in terms of resources, never quite matched the depth of genuine engagement you describe. I was taught to display knowledge, much as you suggest, rather than to genuinely pursue it. I begin to suspect I have been rather poorly served by my own privilege in that regard. It was a remarkable admission, and Alina found herself studying him with fresh interest, recognizing in his words a genuine capacity for self-reflection she had not expected to find beneath his earlier arrogance. As the evening progressed, the conversation grew steadily more personal, drifting away from matters of education and language into more private territory. The Duke spoke, with evident hesitation at first, of his father's sudden passing years earlier, of the weight of responsibility that had settled upon him far younger than he had been prepared for, of the careful, guarded persona he had cultivated in the years since, as a means of protecting himself from a world that seemed determined to judge him solely by his title rather than his character. "I have spent years," he admitted quietly, as the other guests had drifted into their own conversations, leaving him and Alina in a rare moment of relative privacy near the end of the long table, "surrounded by people who agree with everything I say, who laugh at every jest regardless of its merit, who flatter rather than challenge. I had begun to believe, I think, that such flattery represented genuine respect. You proved otherwise rather thoroughly, and I find I am grateful for it, however uncomfortable the lesson proved at the time." Alina studied him carefully, searching for any trace of performance in his words, but found instead something that seemed genuinely vulnerable, a rare crack in the carefully maintained composure he typically presented to the world. "I did not intend cruelty, Your Grace," she said gently. "Only honesty." "I am beginning to understand," the Duke replied, "that honesty and cruelty are not nearly as similar as I once believed them to be. I mistook flattery for kindness for far too long and dismissed honesty as mere insolence. You have shown me the difference rather clearly." The evening drew to a close far too quickly for Alina's liking, though she would not have admitted as much aloud even to herself. As the guests began preparing for their departure, the Duke walked with Alina and her family toward the entrance hall, his manner considerably warmer than the careless dismissal he had shown at the ball only weeks earlier. "Miss Whitfield," he said quietly, as her father and aunt moved ahead toward the waiting carriage, "I wonder whether you might permit me to call upon your family again, perhaps to discuss further matters of literature and philosophy. I find myself, rather unexpectedly, quite eager to continue our conversation." Alina considered the request carefully, aware of the complicated web of social expectation and genuine curiosity that surrounded such an invitation. A duke calling upon a clergyman's daughter carried implications far beyond simple friendly conversation, implications that would not go unnoticed by a county already buzzing with gossip about their previous encounters. Yet despite this awareness, she found herself unable to refuse, curious despite her own careful reservations about what further conversation with this unexpectedly thoughtful man might reveal. "I believe my father would welcome such a visit, Your Grace," she said carefully, "provided it remains conducted with proper propriety, given the considerable difference in our circumstances." "Of course," the Duke agreed readily. "I would expect nothing less, Miss Whitfield, and I would ask nothing less of myself." As the carriage carried Alina and her family back toward the vicarage beneath a sky now fully dark and scattered with stars, she found her thoughts returning again and again to the evening's conversation, to the unexpected depth she had discovered beneath the Duke's earlier arrogance, to the genuine vulnerability he had shown in admitting his own limitations and misjudgments. She told herself, as she had told herself before, that her interest remained purely intellectual, a natural curiosity about a man whose character had proven considerably more complex than her initial impression suggested. Yet even as she offered herself this careful justification, she could not entirely ignore the persistent flutter of anticipation that accompanied the thought of his promised visit, nor the quiet, unfamiliar warmth that had settled in her chest as she recalled the genuine respect in his eyes throughout their conversation. Behind her at Ashworth Manor, the Duke stood alone in his study long after his guests had departed, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace with an expression his closest friends would scarcely have recognized, thoughtful, uncertain, and entirely unlike the confident, carelessly superior man who had mocked a plain gray gown only weeks before. He had entered this affair seeking to reclaim his wounded pride. He was beginning to suspect, with growing and rather uncomfortable certainty, that he had found something else entirely, something considerably more valuable and considerably more complicated than mere vindication. The weeks that followed brought a steady rhythm of visits between Ashworth Manor and the small vicarage, each one conducted with careful propriety, always in the presence of Aline's father or aunt, always framed as intellectual discussion rather than anything more personal. Yet despite this careful framework, both Aline and the Duke found themselves increasingly aware of a connection growing between them that extended well beyond shared interest in literature and language. The Duke began arriving with books borrowed from his own considerable library, texts he thought might interest Aline, and she in turn began recommending volumes from her father's more modest collection, works she suspected might challenge his previously narrow understanding of certain philosophical questions. Their conversations grew longer with each visit, ranging across history, ethics, poetry, and increasingly, though neither would have readily admitted it, into more personal territory concerning their hopes, their fears, and the quiet dissatisfactions each had carried long before their paths first crossed at the ball. Aline found herself, much to her own surprise, genuinely anticipating these visits, counting the days between them with an eagerness she had not expected, and was not entirely certain how to interpret. The Duke, for his part, began finding excuses to extend his time in the county, rather than attending to matters that would ordinarily have called him to London or to his other estates, a change in behavior that did not escape the notice of those closest to him. It was inevitable, given the nature of county society, that such a pattern would not go unnoticed for long. Lord Hargrove, still nursing the wound to his pride from the events at the Bellamy estate, watched the growing familiarity between the Duke and Aline with mounting resentment. He had hoped, in the aftermath of the initial embarrassment, that the entire affair might quietly fade, allowing life to return to its familiar order, with the Duke once more secure in his position atop the county's social hierarchy, and Aline returned to the relative obscurity from which she had emerged. Instead, he found himself watching his closest friend grow increasingly attached to a woman Hargrove still regarded, however unfairly, as an unwelcome disruption to the natural order of things. He was not alone in his concerns. Lady Beatrice Ashworth, the Duke's younger sister, recently returned from an extended stay with relatives in London, arrived at Ashworth Manor to find her brother's household abuzz with talk of the clergyman's daughter who had apparently captured his attention through some remarkable display of linguistic skill. Lady Beatrice, considerably more concerned with matters of social standing than intellectual accomplishment, expressed her disapproval to her brother with characteristic bluntness during a private conversation shortly after her arrival. "Edmund," she said, settling into a chair across from him in his study with the particular firmness she reserved for matters she considered urgent, "the entire county is discussing your fascination with this vicar's daughter. Surely you understand the implications of such attention, however innocently intended." The Duke regarded his sister with patient, if slightly weary, attention, having anticipated this conversation for some time. "Beatrice, Miss Whitfield possesses a mind sharper than most I have encountered among our own circle. I fail to see why genuine intellectual respect should concern anyone." "Intellectual respect," Lady Beatrice repeated, her tone suggesting she found the phrase rather too diplomatic for the reality she perceived. "Edmund, you are a duke. Your attention, however innocently intended, carries weight and consequence that a country clergyman's daughter simply cannot navigate without damage to her own reputation, regardless of your intentions. And your own reputation, need I remind you, has already suffered considerably from the gossip surrounding your previous encounters with her. The Duke felt a flash of irritation, though he recognized, beneath it, the genuine concern motivating his sister's words. What would you have me do, Beatrice? Abandon a friendship built on genuine respect simply because society insists on interpreting it through a narrower lens than it deserves? I would have you consider, Lady Beatrice replied carefully, what you truly intend by this continued attention. If your interest is purely intellectual, as you claim, then perhaps greater discretion would serve everyone's interests. But if your feelings extend beyond mere intellectual curiosity, Edmund, then you owe it to Miss Whitfield, and to yourself, to consider the very real consequences such feelings would carry for both of you, given the considerable difference in your circumstances. The Duke said nothing in response, though his sister's words lingered with him long after their conversation ended, forcing him to confront questions he had been carefully avoiding in the weeks since his dinner with Aliner's family. He told himself, repeatedly, that his interest remained primarily intellectual, a genuine appreciation for a mind unlike any he had previously encountered. Yet even as he offered himself this explanation, he found it increasingly difficult to ignore the quiet warmth that settled in his chest whenever Aliner entered a room, the way his thoughts returned to her during quiet moments throughout the day, the genuine disappointment he felt on days when circumstance prevented their planned visits. Meanwhile, Lord Hargrove, sensing an opportunity in the growing tension surrounding the Duke's attachment, began a quiet campaign of his own, one considerably less direct than Lady Beatrice's honest concern, and considerably more calculated in its cruelty. He began circulating suggestions among the county's more influential families that Aliner's continued closeness with the Duke reflected calculated ambition rather than genuine friendship, that the vicar's daughter had recognized an opportunity for advancement through the earlier ballroom incident, and had deliberately cultivated further encounters to secure the Duke's attention for her own benefit. These whispers found receptive audiences among certain segments of society, already inclined toward suspicion of anyone who threatened the established order, and within days, Aliner began noticing a distinct coolness among some who had previously welcomed her, with newfound admiration following the events at the Bellamy estate. Invitations that had arrived with increasing frequency began slowing, and she caught, on more than one occasion, whispered conversations that ceased abruptly upon her approach, accompanied by knowing glances she could not entirely misinterpret. The situation reached a difficult culmination during a gathering at the county assembly rooms, an event considerably less grand than Ashworth Manor's ball, but attended by much of the same social circle. Aliner arrived with her aunt, hoping for a pleasant evening of dancing and conversation, only to find herself the subject of pointed, if carefully veiled, commentary from several guests clearly influenced by Hargrove's whispered suggestions. "Miss Whitfield," said one young woman, her smile carrying an edge sharp enough to cut despite its polite surface, "how fortunate you have been, securing such considerable attention from His Grace. One wonders what ambition such attention might inspire in a young woman of your particular circumstances." Aliner felt the barb clearly, though she maintained her composure with practiced discipline. "I have no ambitions beyond genuine friendship, Miss Carlyle," she replied evenly, "though I confess I am surprised such friendship has become a matter of such considerable public interest." "Friendship," another guest echoed, with a small, knowing laugh that carried more implication than the word itself deserved. How charitable a description for what the entire county has been discussing, rather more plainly. Aliner felt her cheeks warm, though this time the sensation carried considerably more discomfort than the earlier confrontation at the ball had produced. There, she had faced open cruelty she could answer directly, could counter with clear demonstration of her own worth. Here, she faced something more insidious, whispered suggestion and implication that could not be so easily countered with a well-chosen phrase in French or Latin, cruelty dressed in the polite language of society rather than open mockery. She excused herself from the conversation as gracefully as she could manage, retreating toward a quieter corner of the room, where her aunt found her a short while later, her expression carrying evident concern. "Eleanor, dear, are you well? You look rather pale." "I am well enough, Aunt Margaret," Eleanor replied, though her voice carried less certainty than her words suggested. "I had simply not anticipated how difficult this attention would become, particularly when it arrives disguised as polite conversation rather than open confrontation." Across the room, the Duke, who had arrived somewhat later than Eleanor and had been engaged in conversation with several county gentlemen upon his arrival, noticed her evident distress from a distance and made his way toward her, his expression carrying genuine concern rather than his usual composed confidence. "Miss Whitfield," he said quietly upon reaching her, "you seem troubled. Has something occurred?" Eleanor hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal, aware that whatever she shared would likely reach Hargrove and others eventually regardless of her discretion. Yet something in the Duke's genuine concern encouraged honesty rather than careful deflection. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I find that continued association with your family carries consequences I had not fully anticipated. Whispers suggesting calculated ambition rather than genuine friendship have begun circulating, and I confess I am uncertain how best to navigate such implications without causing further difficulty for either of us." The Duke's expression darkened with genuine anger, though Eleanor understood immediately that the anger was directed not at her, but at whoever had begun such unfounded suggestions. "Who has said such things?" he asked, his voice carrying a sharpness Eleanor had not heard since their first encounter, though this time directed entirely differently. "It hardly matters who first suggested it, Your Grace," Eleanor replied gently. "The suggestion has clearly found willing ears among those already inclined toward such interpretation. I wonder, in truth, whether continued association between us serves either of our interests, given the difficulties it appears to be causing." The Duke studied her carefully, and Eleanor saw, in his expression, a genuine struggle between his own growing feelings and his awareness of the very real consequences such feelings carried for a woman in her position. Consequences that would fall far more heavily upon her than upon himself, protected as he was by the considerable weight of his title and fortune. "Eleanor," he said quietly, using her given name for the first time since they had met, his voice carrying an intensity that made her breath catch unexpectedly. "I will not pretend that our continued association carries no risk to your reputation, nor will I pretend that I have not considered, rather more seriously than I initially intended, what my own feelings toward you have become. But I would ask you this. Do you wish for our association to end, out of concern for how others might interpret it? Or do you find yourself, as I have, genuinely reluctant to see it conclude, whatever difficulties it might bring?" Eleanor felt her heart racing at the direct nature of his question, at the vulnerability evident in his voice, despite his usual careful composure. She considered her answer carefully, aware that whatever she said next would likely determine the course of whatever remained between them. "Your Grace," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady, "I find myself, much to my own surprise, considerably more reluctant than practical wisdom would suggest to see our friendship end, whatever consequences it might continue to bring." The Duke's expression softened considerably at her words, though the concern in his eyes did not entirely fade. "Then we shall face those consequences together, Eleanor, whatever they might prove to be. I have spent my entire life avoiding genuine connection out of fear of exactly this kind of complication. I find I am no longer willing to let that fear govern my choices, particularly not where you are concerned." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Lord Hargrove himself, his expression carrying a carefully maintained pleasantness that did not entirely mask the calculation beneath it. "Your Grace," he said smoothly, "Miss Whitfield, I hope I am not interrupting anything of particular importance." The Duke turned to regard his old friend with an expression considerably cooler than Alina had seen him direct toward Hargrove before. "Percival," he said evenly, "I understand certain suggestions regarding Miss Whitfield's character have been circulating rather widely of late. I wonder whether you might know anything about their origin." Hargrove's carefully maintained smile flickered just briefly before recovering. "I could not say, Edmund. Society does love its gossip, particularly where matters as interesting as your own recent attentions are concerned." "Indeed," the Duke replied, his tone carrying an edge that suggested he understood considerably more than he chose to state directly. "I would ask, as a friend, that you consider carefully whatever role you might play, intentionally or otherwise, in perpetuating such unfounded suggestions going forward. I would hate to see our own friendship suffer over a matter so easily avoided through simple discretion." Hargrove's expression tightened, understanding clearly the warning embedded within the Duke's carefully measured words, though he offered only a stiff nod before excusing himself, his earlier confidence considerably diminished. Alina watched the exchange with quiet interest, recognizing in the Duke's careful but firm response a genuine willingness to defend her, however subtly, against the whispered cruelties circulating through the county's social circles. It was, she realized, a considerable departure from the man who had mocked her plain gray gown in flawless French only weeks before, and the realization settled something warm and unfamiliar deep within her chest, a feeling she was no longer entirely certain she wished to resist. The days following the assembly rooms brought a fragile peace to Alina's life, though it did not last. Lord Hargrove, stung by the Duke's pointed warning, retreated for a time from open commentary, but his resentment had not faded, only shifted into quieter, more calculated channels. Where he had once relied on suggestion and implication, he now began constructing something considerably more deliberate, a scheme designed not merely to embarrass Alina, but to sever her connection to the Duke entirely. He found his opportunity through Lady Constance's younger cousin, a woman named Harriet Vane, who had long harbored her own hopes regarding the Duke's attention, and who had watched his growing fascination with Alina with poorly disguised jealousy. Hargrove approached her carefully, framing his intentions as concern for the Duke's reputation rather than personal malice, and together they began constructing a narrative considerably more damaging than mere whispers of calculated ambition. The story that began circulating claimed that Alina had, prior to her arrival in the county, been involved in a scandal in her previous parish, a fabricated tale suggesting improper conduct with a young curate that had supposedly forced her family's quiet relocation. There was no truth whatsoever to the claim, but it carried the particular danger of scandal, the kind of story that once spoken could not easily be unspoken, regardless of its accuracy. Alina first learned of the rumor through her aunt, who arrived at breakfast one morning with an expression of genuine distress, a letter trembling in her hands. "Alina," she said, her voice unsteady, "I have received the most troubling correspondence from Mrs. Pemberton. She writes that certain claims are being made about your character, claims I know to be entirely false, but which are spreading rather rapidly through the county." Alina read the letter with growing horror, understanding immediately the severity of what she now faced. Unlike the earlier whispers of ambition, which had been unpleasant but ultimately survivable, this new rumor struck at something far more damaging, her reputation as a respectable young woman, the very foundation upon which her place in society, however modest, had always rested. "This is not true," she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain composed. "None of it is true, Aunt Margaret. I have never even met a curate by that name." "I know, dear," her aunt said gently, though her expression carried genuine worry. "But you understand how such things work. The truth matters considerably less than the willingness of others to believe and repeat what they have heard, particularly when it concerns a young woman who has already drawn more attention than most in her circumstances." Reverend Whitfield, upon learning of the rumor, grew uncharacteristically angry, his usual calm composure cracking beneath the weight of watching his daughter's character so viciously and falsely attacked. "I will not stand for this," he declared, though even as he spoke the words, all three of them understood the limited power a country clergyman held against the machinery of society gossip, however unjust its origins. Word of the rumor reached Ashworth Manor within days, carried, ironically, by Lady Beatrice, who had heard the whispers during a visit to a neighboring estate, and had rushed home to inform her brother, genuinely concerned despite her earlier reservations about his attachment to Alina. The Duke's reaction, upon hearing the fabricated claims, was immediate and unmistakably furious. He questioned Lady Beatrice carefully about the rumor's origins, and though she could not identify the source with certainty, the pattern of its spread suggested strongly that it had begun within their own social circle rather than traveling from Alina's previous parish, a detail that pointed with growing certainty toward Hargrove's involvement. The Duke summoned Hargrove to Ashworth Manor that very afternoon, and the conversation that followed, conducted behind the closed doors of the Duke's study, proved considerably less friendly than any exchange between the two men in years. "Percival," the Duke said, his voice carrying a coldness that made even his old friend visibly uncomfortable, "I want the truth. Did you have any part in the rumor currently circulating regarding Miss Whitfield's character?" Hargrove attempted at first to maintain his innocence, but the Duke's pointed questions, combined with his own evident nervousness, gradually eroded his defenses until he finally admitted, with considerable reluctance, his role in constructing the fabricated story alongside Harriet Vane. "Edmund, you must understand," Hargrove said, his voice carrying a desperate edge. "I only meant to protect your reputation. This attachment to a clergyman's daughter, however clever she might be, threatens everything you have built. Your family's standing, your future prospects, all of it jeopardized by a passing fascination that could never lead to anything appropriate given the difference in your circumstances." The Duke's expression hardened further at these words, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a finality that left no room for further discussion. "You have spread lies about an innocent woman's character, Percival, out of some misguided notion of protecting my interests. I did not ask for such protection, and I would never have wanted it purchased at the cost of another person's genuine reputation and dignity. Our friendship, such as it has been, ends here. I want you to understand that clearly." Hargrove attempted further protest, but the Duke would not be moved, and within the hour Hargrove departed Ashworth Manor for the final time, his long friendship with the Duke severed entirely by his own calculated cruelty. The Duke's next action proved considerably more significant than the private confrontation with his former friend. Recognizing that private acknowledgement of Hargrove's guilt would do little to repair the damage already done to Alina's reputation, he determined that only a public correction, delivered with the full weight of his own position and influence, could adequately address the harm caused by the fabricated rumor. He arranged, within days, for a gathering at Ashworth Manor considerably larger than the intimate dinner that had marked his family's first proper introduction to Alina, inviting nearly the entire social circle that had been party to the spreading rumor, framing the invitation as a celebration of the harvest season, though his true purpose lay elsewhere entirely. Alina, upon receiving word of the Duke's intentions through a carefully worded letter, felt a mixture of gratitude and considerable apprehension. "He intends to address the matter publicly," she told her father, reading the letter's careful phrasing. "I confess I am uncertain whether such a public confrontation will help matters or simply provide further fuel for gossip, regardless of its intended correction." "Sometimes," her father said thoughtfully, "the only remedy for a public wrong is an equally public correction. I trust the Duke has considered this carefully, given what we have witnessed of his character in recent weeks." The evening of the gathering arrived with a tension Alina found difficult to shake, despite her father's reassurance and her own determination to face whatever came with the same composure that had carried her through her earlier confrontations with the Duke. She dressed carefully, choosing a gown that struck a careful balance between modesty and quiet dignity, and made her way to Ashworth Manor with her family, aware that this evening would likely prove decisive in determining how the county's society would ultimately regard her, regardless of the truth underlying the fabricated claims against her. The great hall of Ashworth Manor, though not as elaborately decorated as it had been for the original ball, still carried an impressive grandeur, filled now with many of the same faces that had witnessed both Aliner's original triumph, and more recently, the whispered cruelties surrounding the fabricated scandal. She felt the weight of curious, uncertain glances as she entered, some sympathetic, others considerably more skeptical, and she steadied herself with a slow, careful breath, reminding herself of her father's teaching that dignity, once chosen, could not easily be taken away by the judgment of others. The Duke found her shortly after her arrival, his expression carrying a quiet determination that offered her some measure of reassurance despite her nervousness. "Aliner," he said quietly, using her given name as he had begun to do in private moments between them, "I intend to address this matter directly tonight before the assembled company. I wanted you to know beforehand so that whatever follows does not come as an unwelcome surprise." "Thank you," Aliner said, though her voice carried evident uncertainty. "Your Grace, I confess I worry this might only draw further attention to a matter better left to quietly fade rather than confronted so directly." "Some matters," the Duke replied gently, "cannot simply be left to fade, particularly when they threaten to permanently damage the character of someone entirely undeserving of such treatment. I will not allow lies to stand unanswered, Aliner, whatever discomfort the correction might bring in the immediate term." As the evening progressed and the guests gathered in the great hall, the Duke eventually called for quiet, his commanding presence drawing the attention of the assembled company with practiced ease. Aliner stood near her father, her heart pounding as she watched him prepare to speak, uncertain exactly what words he intended to offer but trusting, despite her nervousness, in the genuine conviction she had witnessed in him throughout their growing friendship. "Friends," the Duke began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "I have called you together this evening under the pretense of celebrating the harvest season, though I confess a more pressing matter compels me to address you directly. It has come to my attention that certain false and deeply damaging claims have been circulating regarding the character of Miss Aliner Whitfield, claims entirely without foundation, deliberately constructed and spread by individuals whose motives I will not dignify with further discussion tonight." A murmur passed through the assembled guests, and Aliner felt every eye in the room shift toward her, though she forced herself to remain composed, meeting the Duke's steady gaze with quiet gratitude. "I have known Miss Whitfield for several weeks now," the Duke continued, "and in that time I have witnessed nothing but genuine intelligence, unwavering honesty, and a character of remarkable strength and dignity. She humbled me, quite thoroughly in 3 languages, when I offered her nothing but careless cruelty at our first meeting. Rather than harboring resentment, she has shown me, through patient example, the difference between genuine wit and mere performance, between true nobility of character and the hollow privilege of inherited title. I owe her a debt I cannot easily repay, and I will not stand by while baseless rumors attempt to destroy what she has rightfully earned through her own considerable merit." The hall fell utterly silent, and Aliner felt tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, moved beyond words by the genuine conviction in the Duke's voice, by his willingness to stake his own considerable reputation on her defense before the very society whose opinion had once seemed so impossibly powerful. "I would ask," the Duke concluded, his gaze sweeping across the assembled guests with quiet authority, "that anyone who has repeated these false claims consider carefully the harm such careless gossip inflicts, and that you extend to Miss Whitfield the same respect and consideration any person of genuine character deserves, regardless of the modesty of her birth." For a long moment, silence held the great hall, and Aliner wondered whether the Duke's words had achieved their intended effect, or whether the damage already done proved too significant to be undone by even his considerable influence. Then, slowly, Lady Constance Bellamy stepped forward from among the gathered guests, her expression carrying genuine conviction. "His Grace speaks the truth," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the hall. "I witnessed Miss Whitfield's character firsthand, and I can attest that nothing in these fabricated rumors bears any resemblance to the woman I have come to know and genuinely admire." One by one, others among the guests began adding their own voices, some who had witnessed Eleanor's remarkable composure at the Bellamy estate, others who had simply grown to respect her through their own limited interactions, until the tide of public opinion, so recently turned against her through calculated cruelty, began shifting once more, this time firmly in her favor. Eleanor stood amid the gathering crowd, tears now falling freely despite her attempts to maintain composure, overwhelmed by the unexpected outpouring of support and by the Duke's evident willingness to risk his own reputation entirely for her sake. When at last the crowd began to disperse into smaller conversations, the Duke made his way toward her, his own expression carrying quiet relief mixed with something considerably deeper. "Eleanor," he said softly, reaching for her hand with a gentleness that made her breath catch, "I hope this evening has offered you some measure of the justice you rightfully deserved." "Your Grace," Eleanor managed, her voice thick with emotion, "I do not know how to properly thank you for such a defense." "You need not thank me," the Duke replied, his thumb tracing a gentle, absent pattern across the back of her hand. "I have simply spoken the truth, Eleanor, a truth I have come to understand rather more deeply than I ever expected when I first mocked your gown in careless French all those weeks ago. You have changed me, quite thoroughly, and I find myself entirely unwilling to imagine my life continuing without your presence within it." The weeks following the gathering at Ashworth Manor brought a transformation in Eleanor's circumstances that she could scarcely have imagined when she first stepped reluctantly into her aunt's carriage months earlier, dreading an evening among strangers who would surely look down upon her modest origins. The fabricated rumor, so thoroughly and publicly dismantled by the Duke's impassioned defense, faded quickly from society's attention, replaced instead by growing admiration for the remarkable young woman who had not only bested the county's most formidable nobleman in wit, but had done so with such grace and integrity that even her fiercest critics found themselves gradually won over. Lord Hargrove, his friendship with the Duke permanently severed and his reputation considerably diminished by the revelation of his role in the fabricated scandal, quietly withdrew from the county's social circles altogether, eventually relocating to distant relations in the north, where his name carried none of the weight it had once held. Harriet Vane, her own involvement exposed alongside his, found herself similarly ostracized, a consequence she had clearly not anticipated when she first agreed to participate in Hargrove's calculated scheme. For Eleanor, the aftermath of these difficult weeks brought an unexpected clarity regarding her own feelings she had spent considerable effort trying to dismiss as mere intellectual curiosity in the earlier stages of her acquaintance with the Duke. She could no longer pretend that her interest in his company stemmed purely from shared appreciation for literature and philosophy. She found herself genuinely, deeply attached to the man who had once mocked her plain gray gown, transformed now into someone whose company she treasured beyond simple friendship. The Duke, for his part, made no secret of his own growing affection, calling upon the vicarage with increasing frequency, always conducted with careful propriety, though the warmth between them had grown considerably beyond what mere friendship typically allowed. Reverend Whitfield, watching this development with the careful attention of a father genuinely concerned for his daughter's well-being, found himself gradually reassured by the evident sincerity of the Duke's continued attention, recognizing in him a genuine transformation from the arrogant young nobleman who had first mocked his daughter's education. It was on a quiet autumn afternoon, several months after their first fateful encounter, that the Duke finally called upon Reverend Whitfield with intentions considerably more formal than his previous visits. Eleanor, occupied in the small garden behind the vicarage, tending to the last of the season's flowers, remained unaware of the private conversation taking place within her father's study, unaware that the Duke was formally requesting permission to court her daughter with the ultimate intention of marriage. Reverend Whitfield, having watched the relationship develop over months with careful attention, granted his permission readily, though not without offering the Duke a final, pointed reminder of the character he expected him to maintain. "Your Grace," the Reverend said, his tone gentle but firm, "my daughter has faced considerable difficulty on account of her association with your family, difficulty she weathered with remarkable grace and dignity. I trust you understand the responsibility you now undertake, not merely toward her happiness, but toward ensuring she is never again subjected to the kind of unfounded cruelty she has already endured." "Reverend," the Duke replied, his voice carrying genuine solemnity, "I give you my word that I will spend whatever remains of my life ensuring your daughter never again doubts her own worth, nor faces judgment for circumstances beyond her control. She has taught me more about genuine character in these past months than my entire privileged upbringing managed to instill in me across 2 decades. I intend to honor that lesson for the remainder of my days." Satisfied by the evident sincerity in the Duke's words, Reverend Whitfield granted his blessing, and the Duke made his way into the garden where Eleanor continued her quiet work among the flowers, unaware of the conversation that had just concluded within her father's study. She looked up as he approached, offering the warm smile that had become so familiar to him over the preceding months, a smile entirely different from the cautious politeness she had shown him during their first difficult encounters. "Your Grace," she said, brushing dirt from her hands, "I did not expect your visit today." "Eleanor," the Duke said, and something in his voice, some careful gravity beneath his usual composed manner, made her pause, studying his expression with sudden curiosity. "I have just spoken with your father, and I find myself standing here now with a question I have wanted to ask for rather longer than propriety would typically allow." Eleanor felt her heart begin to race, understanding suddenly the significance of the moment unfolding before her, though she remained silent, allowing him the space to continue. "When I first met you," the Duke continued, his voice growing steadily more earnest, "I was a man convinced of his own superiority, blind to the genuine worth of anything that did not conform to my narrow understanding of what mattered in this world. You shattered that conviction rather thoroughly, first with your French, then with your Italian, and finally, most devastatingly of all, with your Latin, leaving me not merely speechless but genuinely transformed. I have spent every day since that first humbling encounter growing more certain that whatever life I had imagined for myself, before meeting you was considerably poorer than the life I might build alongside someone of your remarkable character." He reached for her hands, holding them gently within his own, and knelt before her among the autumn flowers, his expression carrying a vulnerability she had never expected to witness from the proud, arrogant man who had first mocked her modest gown. "Eleanor Whitfield," he said, "I love you quite entirely and without reservation. I love your intelligence, your dignity, your unwavering honesty, and the quiet strength you have shown throughout every difficulty this association has brought you. I would be honored, more than I can adequately express, if you would consent to become my wife, and to spend the remainder of our lives building something genuine together, far removed from the empty performances and hollow flattery I once mistook for meaningful connection." Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes as she looked down at him, overwhelmed by the sincerity of his words, by the remarkable journey that had brought them from that first cruel remark in French to this quiet garden moment months later. She thought of her father's teaching, that true worth lay not in circumstance but in character, and she recognized, with quiet certainty, that the man kneeling before her had proven himself worthy of that very lesson, transformed by genuine humility rather than mere circumstance. "Yes," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion but carrying unmistakable certainty. "Yes, Edmund, I will marry you." The Duke rose, his own eyes bright with emotion he made no attempt to hide, and gathered her into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any words of the genuine transformation their unlikely acquaintance had wrought in both their lives. Around them, the last flowers of autumn swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, witness to a moment neither of them would ever forget, the culmination of a journey that had begun with careless cruelty and ended in genuine, hard-won love. Their wedding, held the following spring at the small village church where Reverend Whitfield had served for so many years, drew guests from across the county, many of whom had once dismissed Eleanor as beneath their notice, now eager to witness the union that had become, in its own quiet way, something of a local legend. Lady Constance Bellamy served as one of Eleanor's attendants, her earlier amusement at Eleanor's expense long since transformed into genuine friendship. Lady Beatrice, initially so concerned about the implications of her brother's attachment, stood among the guests with evident joy, having come to recognize in Eleanor a sister-in-law considerably more worthy than any match arranged purely for social advantage could have provided. Eleanor walked down the modest aisle of her father's church in a gown considerably finer than the simple gray dress she had worn to that first fateful ball, though she had insisted, against her aunt's initial protests, on choosing something that reflected her own quiet taste rather than the elaborate fashions typically favored by the aristocracy she was marrying into. The Duke, watching her approach with an expression of undisguised joy, thought her more beautiful in that moment than any woman he had ever encountered in all his years moving through society's most glittering circles, and he understood with complete certainty that true worth had never resided in silk and jewels, but in the character and conviction of the person wearing them. Reverend Whitfield, performing the ceremony himself despite the emotional difficulty of officiating his own daughter's wedding, spoke with evident pride of the journey that had brought them to this moment, of a young woman who had never once compromised her principles despite considerable pressure to do so, and of a young man who had proven himself capable of genuine growth and transformation when confronted with the limitations of his own earlier arrogance. As the ceremony concluded, and the newly married couple made their way from the church into the bright spring sunshine, greeted by the cheers and well wishes of gathered friends and neighbors, Eleanor found herself reflecting on how remarkably her life had changed since that first uncertain evening at Ashworth Manor, when she had stood near the tall windows in her plain gray dress, dreading the judgment of strangers she was certain would never see her true worth. She had been right in a sense. That evening would change everything, though not in the way she had feared. Rather than confirming her fears of permanent exclusion from a world that valued birth over character, that evening had ultimately proven the opposite, that genuine worth, once demonstrated with sufficient courage and conviction, could not be permanently denied, regardless of how deeply entrenched the prejudices arrayed against it might initially appear. In the years that followed their marriage, Eleanor and Edmund built a life together considerably different from the empty performances and hollow social maneuvering that had once defined the Duke's existence before their fateful meeting. Ashworth Manor, once known primarily for its grand balls and glittering displays of wealth, gradually became known throughout the county for something rather more substantial, a genuine center of learning and thoughtful conversation, where scholars and thinkers of all backgrounds found themselves welcomed regardless of their birth or fortune. Eleanor, now Duchess of Ashworth, used her new position not to distance herself from her modest origins, but to expand opportunities for others who might otherwise have been overlooked in the same way she once was. She established a small school in the village near her father's church, providing education to children regardless of their family's income, insisting that knowledge, as her father had always taught her, belonged to anyone willing to pursue it with sufficient dedication. She filled the library at Ashworth Manor with texts spanning countless languages and disciplines, transforming a space once reserved for decorative display into a genuine center of study, open to any tenant or servant on the estate who wished to expand their own education. The Duke, transformed by his marriage in ways even his closest family had not fully anticipated, became known throughout the region for a fairness and generosity considerably different from the careless arrogance that had once characterized his public reputation. He maintained his position of influence and authority, but wielded it now with genuine consideration for those beneath him in circumstance, remembering always the lesson Eleanor had taught him in that first devastating exchange, that true nobility resided in character and conduct, not merely in inherited title. Reverend Whitfield lived many more years in his quiet parish, watching with evident pride as his daughter's influence spread throughout the county, never once seeking to claim credit for the remarkable woman he had raised, content simply to know that his careful teachings, offered by candlelight through long winter evenings, had ultimately borne fruit far beyond what he could have imagined when he first began instructing his young daughter in the careful discipline of Latin declensions and French vocabulary. Lady Constance Bellamy remained a close and trusted friend to Alinor throughout the years, their friendship strengthened rather than diminished by the unusual circumstances of its origin. She often told the story of that remarkable afternoon at her family's estate, when a country clergyman's daughter had humbled a duke across 3 languages, and though the tale grew somewhat in the retelling over the years, the essential truth at its heart remained unchanged. That genuine character, once properly demonstrated, could not be permanently denied its rightful recognition. Lord Hargrove, from his distant exile in the north, occasionally heard word of the Duke and Duchess's continued happiness and the growing respect they commanded throughout society, and though he never fully reconciled with his former friend, the passage of years gradually softened whatever bitterness remained from his own poor conduct, replaced eventually by a grudging acknowledgment that he had badly misjudged both the Duke's character and Alinor's own remarkable worth. Alinor and Edmund's own children, when they eventually arrived, grew up in a household considerably different from the rigid, performance-driven world their father had once inhabited before his transformative encounter with their mother. They were raised, much as Alinor herself had been, with genuine respect for knowledge and character over mere appearance and social standing, taught from an early age that true worth had nothing whatsoever to do with the accident of one's birth, and everything to do with the deliberate cultivation of wisdom, kindness, and unwavering integrity. Years later, when Alinor's own daughter asked her, during a quiet evening by the fire, how exactly she had come to marry a duke despite her modest beginnings as a simple clergyman's daughter, Alinor would smile and tell the story much as it had actually happened, of a proud young man who had mocked her plain gray gown in careless French, never imagining that the quiet young woman he dismissed so easily would answer him not once, but 3 times over, in languages he had never expected her to know, leaving him utterly speechless before an entire hall of stunned witnesses. He learned that evening, Alinor would tell her daughter, her eyes carrying the warm affection of years spent building a genuine partnership with the man who had once wounded her with careless words, that true worth cannot be measured by silk gowns or inherited titles, but only by the depth of one's character and the courage to stand firmly by one's convictions, regardless of how the world might initially choose to judge them. Never let anyone convince you that your own worth depends on anything other than the strength of your own mind and the integrity of your own heart, for those, my dear, are the only true measures that matter in the end. And so the story of the clergyman's daughter who answered a duke's cruel French with equal measures of Italian grace and Latin precision became, in time, not merely a piece of county legend retold at dinner parties and social gatherings, but a genuine testament to the enduring truth that character, courage, and quiet dignity could overcome even the deepest prejudices of birth and circumstance, transforming not only the life of the woman who dared to speak her truth, but the life of the proud man humbled enough to finally listen,